Captain Emma Sullivan stood exactly 5 feet, 6 inches tall, 2 inches shorter than the F-22 Raptor cockpit requirements, and 2 inches away from her dream of flying the world's most advanced fighter jet. What the Air Force didn't know was that in 18 months, she'd be the only pilot capable of landing a crippled F-22 that had already claimed the lives of 3 test pilots, proving that skill and preparation mattered far more than arbitrary height measurements. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pre-dawn darkness at Holloman Air Force Base was broken only by the distant hum of maintenance crews preparing for another day of flight operations. While most pilots wouldn't arrive for another hour, Captain Emma Sullivan had been in the hangar since 0430 hours, methodically inspecting aircraft she was prohibited from flying. Her flashlight beam swept across the sleek titanium hull of an F-22 Raptor, the most sophisticated fighter aircraft ever built. Every curve, every sensor, every weapon system represented the pinnacle of aerospace engineering. Emma knew every specification by heart: thrust to weight ratio of 1.09, maximum speed of Mach 2.25, stealth capabilities that made it virtually invisible to enemy radar. She could recite maintenance procedures, emergency protocols, and combat tactics with encyclopedic precision. There was just one problem that had defined her entire military career. She needed to be 5 feet, 8 inches tall to qualify as an F-22 pilot. The cockpit design, ejection seat parameters, and control reach requirements had been engineered around that minimum height standard. 2 inches of bone and muscle had determined that Emma Sullivan, despite being one of the most technically proficient pilots in the United States Air Force, would never fly the aircraft she dedicated her life to mastering. "Morning, Captain," called Technical Sergeant Carlos Reeves as he wheeled a fuel cart past her position. "Running your usual inspection routine?" Emma nodded, continuing her systematic examination of the aircraft's external surfaces. "Just making sure everything's ready for today's test flights." Reeves paused, studying Emma's face in the hangar's fluorescent lighting. In the 2 years he'd worked at Holloman's F-22 test facility, he'd watched Emma perform these unofficial inspections every morning. She treated aircraft she'd never pilot with more care and attention than most pilots showed their assigned jets. "You know, Captain," Reeves said carefully, "I've worked with a lot of pilots over the years. Most of them see these birds as machines. You see them as something else." Emma's hand traced along the Raptor's wing edge. "They're not just machines, Sergeant. They're the difference between our pilots coming home alive or in body bags. Every rivet, every system, every component has to be perfect." What Emma didn't say was that she'd been studying F-22 systems with obsessive dedication for 4 years, ever since the height restriction had eliminated her from pilot consideration. While other officers focused on their assigned duties, Emma had made herself an unofficial expert on America's most classified fighter aircraft. She attended every technical briefing, studied every maintenance manual, and absorbed every piece of tactical intelligence about F-22 operations. The irony wasn't lost on her. The Air Force had some of the most advanced aircraft in the world, but they were grounded by bureaucratic requirements that prioritized physical measurements over intellectual capability. Emma possessed spatial awareness. That impressed veteran test pilots, reaction times that exceeded every benchmark, and theoretical knowledge that surpassed officers with years of actual flight experience. None of it mattered because she couldn't reach certain controls without adjusting her seat position beyond regulation parameters. As the hangar began filling with day shift personnel, Emma heard the familiar sound of approaching footsteps. "Captain." Mark Bennett's voice carried across the space with its usual mix of authority and condescension. "Well, if it isn't our resident aircraft inspector," Bennett announced to his group of fellow test pilots. "Sullivan's here bright and early, making sure our jets are clean enough for the real pilots." Bennett was everything. Emma wasn't 6 feet tall, politically connected, and assigned to fly the aircraft Emma studied. He was also reckless, arrogant, and had already been involved in 2 near-miss incidents that Emma had documented in her private notes. The official reports blamed equipment malfunction, but Emma's analysis suggested pilot error in both cases. "Morning, Captain Bennett," Emma replied professionally, not looking up from her inspection checklist. "You know, Sullivan," Bennett continued, clearly performing for his audience, "I've always wondered why you spend so much time around aircraft you'll never fly. Seems like a waste of talent that could be better used in administrative roles." Emma's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Just ensuring operational readiness, sir. These aircraft represent billions of dollars in taxpayer investment, and pilot safety depends on proper maintenance oversight." Lieutenant Jake Turner, one of Bennett's wingmen, chuckled. "Come on, Mark, leave Sullivan alone. At least she knows what she's looking at, which is more than I can say for half the ground crew." "That's exactly my point," Bennett said, warming to his topic. "All that theoretical knowledge, all that dedication, and she'll never actually use it where it matters. The cockpit of an F-22 isn't a classroom, Turner. It's a combat environment that requires physical capability, not just book learning." Emma finally looked up, meeting Bennett's gaze directly. "With respect, Captain, combat effectiveness depends on preparation, decision-making under pressure, and systematic knowledge of aircraft capabilities. Physical requirements are just one component of pilot readiness. Easy to say when you've never faced real pressure at 50,000 feet, Bennett shot back. "Theory and practice are completely different things, Sullivan. The Air Force has height requirements for good reasons." What Bennett didn't know was that Emma had been preparing for exactly that kind of pressure for years. While he spent evenings at the officers' club, Emma was in the flight simulators, running impossible scenarios and emergency procedures. She'd studied every F-22 accident report, analyzed every system failure, and memorized emergency checklists that most pilots only reviewed during annual training. Emma's dedication had a deeply personal motivation that she'd never shared with anyone at Holloman. Her younger sister, Lieutenant Sophie Sullivan, had been killed in an F-16 crash 3 years earlier. The official investigation blamed mechanical failure, but Emma's private analysis suggested that better preparation and more thorough system knowledge could have prevented the accident. Sophie had been everything Emma wasn't tall enough to qualify for any aircraft, naturally gifted at flying, and fast-tracked for advanced fighter assignments. But she'd been careless with technical details, relying on instinct rather than systematic preparation. The night before her fatal flight, Sophie had called Emma with questions about emergency procedures she should have known by heart. "Don't worry so much, Em," Sophie had said during their last conversation. "Flying is about feel, not memorizing manuals. You can't study your way through every situation." Sophie had been wrong, and it had cost her life. Emma had made a promise at her sister's funeral. She would master every detail, prepare for every contingency, and prove that systematic knowledge could prevent the kind of tragedy that had claimed Sophie. As Bennett and his group moved toward their assigned aircraft, Emma returned to her inspection routine. She documented minor discrepancies that most pilots would ignore, noted maintenance requirements that weren't scheduled for weeks, and identified potential issues that could become critical failures under stress. Major Diana Cross, the facility's senior flight instructor, approached Emma's position. Cross was a legend in test pilot circles, a former Thunderbird pilot with over 3,000 hours in various fighter aircraft. She was also one of the few officers at Holloman who treated Emma as a professional equal rather than an administrative curiosity. "Sullivan," Cross said quietly, "walk with me." They moved away from the main hangar area toward a quieter section filled with maintenance equipment. Cross's expression was serious, almost concerned. "I've been watching you for 2 years," Cross began. Your technical knowledge, your attention to detail, your preparation standards. You know these aircraft better than pilots who've been flying them for years. Emma remained silent, unsure where the conversation was heading. I've also been watching our current test program, Cross continued. We've had 17 incidents in the past 6 months. Equipment failures, pilot errors, communication breakdowns. Some of these problems could have been prevented with better preparation and more systematic analysis. Yes, ma'am. I've noticed similar patterns. Cross studied Emma's face. The question is, what are you planning to do about it? Emma felt a surge of frustration that she'd been suppressing for years. With respect, Major, what can I do? I'm 2 inches too short to fly the aircraft I've spent 4 years studying. The system has made it clear that my knowledge and preparation don't matter if I can't meet arbitrary physical requirements. Arbitrary? Cross's eyebrow rose. You think cockpit design parameters are arbitrary? I think they're inflexible, Emma replied carefully. Modern aircraft have adjustable seats, extendable controls, and computerized systems that can accommodate different pilot configurations. The F-22's height restriction is based on engineering assumptions from 15 years ago. Cross nodded slowly. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Because tomorrow we're starting a new evaluation program. And I want you involved. Emma's heart rate increased. Ma'am? The F-22 program is facing pressure from Congress about cost overruns and performance issues. We need pilot consultants who understand the aircraft's capabilities better than anyone currently flying them. Your technical knowledge and systematic approach could be exactly what this program needs. Emma felt hope and skepticism warring in her chest. What kind of consultation, Major? Ground-based analysis, flight planning support, emergency procedure. Development, not flying, but influencing how flying gets done. Cross paused. It's not the cockpit, Sullivan, but it's a step toward changing how the Air Force thinks about pilot qualifications. As Emma processed this unexpected opportunity, neither she nor Major Cross could have predicted that within 18 months, Emma's systematic preparation and theoretical knowledge would become the only thing standing between a catastrophic F-22 crash and the survival of America's most classified test pilot program. The backup pilot was about to become the most important pilot in the United States Air Force. Emma's journey to becoming the Air Force's most knowledgeable F-22 expert began 3 years earlier with a phone call that shattered her world. She'd been studying in her quarters at Luke Air Force Base, preparing for advanced tactical training, when her phone rang at 2,347 hours. Captain Sullivan? The voice belonged to Colonel Stephen Blake from Accident Investigation. I need to inform you that your sister, Lieutenant Sophie Sullivan, was killed this evening in an F-16 training accident at Nellis Air Force Base. Words hit Emma like a physical blow. Sophie, brilliant, fearless Sophie who could fly anything with wings, was gone. The little sister who'd followed Emma into the Air Force, who'd surpassed every one of Emma's achievements, who'd been selected for F-22 training while Emma remained grounded by height restrictions. The official investigation took 6 weeks. Emma read every report, analyzed every piece of evidence, and reached a conclusion that haunted her. Sophie's death was preventable. The F-16's engine had suffered a rare compressor stall during a high-G maneuver. Standard procedure called for immediate throttle reduction and controlled descent. But Sophie had attempted to restart the engine at altitude, a dangerous technique that worked in simulators but proved fatal in real-world conditions. Emma discovered that Sophie had skipped the emergency procedures refresher training 3 weeks before her accident. She'd been confident in her natural flying ability, dismissive of what she called textbook scenarios that never happen in real life. Sophie's flight leader later admitted that she'd seemed rusty on emergency protocols during their pre-flight briefing. The final investigation report was devastating. In its clinical assessment, pilot error. Lieutenant Sullivan failed to follow established emergency procedures during engine malfunction, leading to unrecoverable aircraft attitude and fatal impact. But Emma saw something deeper in the tragedy. Sophie hadn't failed because she lacked skill, she'd failed because she'd never truly believed that systematic preparation mattered more than natural talent. She'd been the golden child, the pilot everyone expected to excel, and that expectation had made her careless with details that seemed beneath her abilities. Emma made 2 promises at Sophie's funeral. First, she would never allow natural confidence to replace systematic preparation. Second, she would master every aircraft system, every emergency procedure, and every technical detail so thoroughly that what happened to Sophie could never happen to anyone under her influence. The path to keeping those promises led Emma to request transfer to Holloman Air Force Base and the F-22 test program. If she couldn't fly the world's most advanced fighter, she would know it better than anyone who could. For 3 years, she'd thrown herself into studying F-22 systems with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Emma's technical knowledge had become legendary among Holloman's maintenance crews. She could diagnose engine problems by sound, identify avionics malfunctions from subtle instrument readings, and predict system failures before they occurred. Mechanics sought her advice on complex repairs. Engineers consulted her on modification proposals. Even pilots like Bennett, who publicly dismissed her contributions, privately relied on her expertise during pre-flight briefings. Major Diana Cross had been watching Emma's development with growing interest. Cross had lost her own brother in an F-18 accident 15 years earlier, a tragedy that had taught her similar lessons about the importance of preparation over presumption. She recognized in Emma a kindred spirit, someone who understood that flying wasn't about conquering the sky, but about respecting the countless details that kept pilots alive. The F-22 program is at a crossroads, Cross explained to Emma during their private meeting the morning after their hangar conversation. They sat in Cross's office, surrounded by technical manuals, flight test reports, and photographs of aircraft that had shaped both their careers. Congress is questioning whether we're getting adequate return on the program's investment, Cross continued. We've had too many incidents, too many cost overruns, too many pilots who treat these aircraft like video games instead of precision instruments. The brass wants new approaches to training and evaluation. Emma leaned forward, studying a chart that showed F-22 incident rates over the previous 2 years. The numbers were troubling. Mechanical failures, pilot errors, and near misses had increased steadily as the program expanded. What kind of new approaches, Major? Ground-based analysis teams. Technical consultants who understand aircraft capabilities better than the pilots flying them. Emergency procedure specialists who can identify potential problems before they become fatal accidents. Cross paused meaningfully. Advisors who care more about keeping pilots alive than about their own flying careers. Emma felt a surge of possibility, mixed with familiar frustration. It sounds like an important program, but it's still not flying. No, Cross agreed. But it's influencing how flying gets done. And sometimes, Sullivan, that's more important than being in the cockpit yourself. Over the following weeks, Emma threw herself into her new consulting role with characteristic intensity. She analyzed flight data from dozens of test missions, identifying patterns that escaped pilots who were focused on immediate performance rather than systemic trends. Her reports revealed concerning tendencies, pilots taking unnecessary risks to meet performance benchmarks, maintenance crews rushing procedures to maintain flight schedules, and training programs that emphasized aircraft capabilities over operational limitations. Emma's most significant discovery came when she cross-referenced pilot performance data with training backgrounds. The statistics were startling. Pilots with the highest natural aptitude scores had significantly higher incident rates than those who'd struggled through initial training. The Air Force's selection process was inadvertently choosing pilots who relied on instinct over systematic preparation. "This is exactly what killed Sophie," Emma told Cross during one of their weekly briefings. "She was so naturally talented that she never learned to respect the aircraft's limitations or her own." Cross studied Emma's analysis with growing concern. "You're suggesting that our best pilots are actually our most dangerous pilots." "I'm suggesting that confidence without systematic preparation is a recipe for tragedy. The F-22 is too complex, too powerful, and too unforgiving for pilots who think natural ability can substitute for thorough knowledge." Emma's consulting work brought her into contact with active F-22 pilots on a daily basis. Most treated her respectfully, recognizing her expertise even if they questioned her authority. But Captain Bennett remained dismissive, often contradicting her recommendations during briefings and encouraging other pilots to trust their instincts over her systematic analysis. The tension came to a head during a flight planning session for an advanced combat maneuvering exercise. Emma had identified potential radar interference patterns that could affect navigation systems during high-altitude operations. Her recommendation was to adjust flight paths by 15 degrees to avoid known electromagnetic anomalies. This is exactly the kind of overcautious thinking that prevents pilots from pushing aircraft their designed limits, Bennett argued in front of a room full of test pilots. Sullivan sees problems that don't exist because she's never actually flown in real-world conditions. Lieutenant Jake Turner, who'd become more receptive to Emma's analysis over time, raised a tentative objection. "Mark, her radar predictions have been accurate in previous exercises. Maybe we should consider—" "Turner, we're test pilots, not academics," Bennett interrupted. "Our job is to find out what these aircraft can actually do, not what some ground-based consultant thinks they should do." Emma felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but she'd learned to channel that frustration into more thorough preparation. "Captain Bennett, the electromagnetic interference isn't theoretical. It's documented in 17 previous test flights, and it's caused navigation errors in 12% of missions flown through those coordinates. And we've adapted to those conditions," Bennett replied. "That's what good pilots do. They adapt. They don't hide behind conservative flight planning to avoid challenges." Emma realized that Bennett's attitude represented everything she'd come to understand about the gap between natural confidence and systematic competence. He was skilled enough to recover from most mistakes, experienced enough to handle most emergencies, and confident enough to believe that his abilities could overcome any situation. He was also exactly the kind of pilot who would someday encounter a problem that required more than skill and experience to solve. When that moment came, Emma was determined to be ready with the knowledge and preparation that could save his life, whether he wanted her help or not. As Emma left the briefing room that evening, she didn't know that Bennett's overconfidence would soon create a crisis that would test every lesson she'd learned from Sophie's death, every hour she'd spent studying aircraft systems, and every principle she'd developed about the relationship between preparation and survival. The confrontation between natural talent and systematic knowledge was about to become a matter of life and death. Emma's expertise had made her indispensable to the F-22 program, but it had also made her a target for officers who resented having their authority questioned by someone they considered a glorified technician. The Air Force's rigid hierarchy didn't know how to classify an officer who possessed more technical knowledge than pilots with twice her experience, but who couldn't officially fly the aircraft she'd mastered. Colonel Robert Hayes, Holloman's commanding officer, embodied this institutional confusion. A career fighter pilot with over 4,000 flight hours, Hayes had built his reputation on traditional military values: follow orders, respect rank, and trust the system that had elevated him to command. Emma's unconventional role as a ground-based F-22 expert challenged every assumption Hayes held about how the Air Force should operate. Captain Sullivan, Hayes said during Emma's quarterly performance review. Your technical contributions have been notable, but I'm concerned about your tendency to exceed your designated role. Emma sat at attention in Hayes's office, surrounded by photographs of the colonel with various aircraft and military dignitaries. She'd prepared for this conversation, knowing that her growing influence had made some officers uncomfortable. Sir, could you be more specific about which activities have exceeded my role? Hayes consulted a file thick with documentation. Last month, you provided tactical recommendations to pilots preparing for combat exercises. 2 weeks ago, you questioned Captain Bennett's flight planning decisions during a mission briefing. Yesterday, you submitted an unsolicited report suggesting modifications to standard emergency procedures. Yes, sir. All of those activities fell within my consulting responsibilities as defined by Major Cross. That's exactly the problem, Sullivan. Your consulting responsibilities seem to expand every week. You're a ground-based technical advisor, not a flight operations commander. There's a reason we have rank structures and chain of command protocols. Emma chose her words carefully. Sir, my recommendations are based on systematic analysis of flight data and aircraft performance patterns. I'm not questioning authority, I'm providing information that could prevent accidents. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying Emma with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. Captain, your knowledge is impressive, but knowledge without proper context can be dangerous. You've never experienced the stress of actual flight operations, never felt the pressure of combat conditions, never had to make split-second decisions with lives at stake. The criticism stung because Emma had heard variations of it throughout her career. No matter how thoroughly she prepared, how accurately she predicted problems, or how valuable her contributions proved to be, she would always be dismissed as someone who just didn't understand real flying. Sir, my sister Lieutenant Sophie Sullivan was killed because she relied on flight experience instead of systematic preparation. She believed that natural ability could substitute for thorough knowledge of emergency procedures. I've dedicated my career to ensuring that kind of preventable tragedy doesn't happen again. Hayes's expression softened slightly. Sophie Sullivan's accident was well known throughout the fighter-pilot community, and her loss had affected many officers who'd known her potential. I understand your motivation, Captain, and I respect your dedication. But the Air Force has procedures. For a reason. We can't have ground-based consultants making operational decisions that should come from experienced pilots. I'm not making operational decisions, sir. I'm providing analysis that helps pilots make better decisions. The distinction isn't as clear as you think, Hayes replied. When you question a senior pilot's judgment in front of junior officers, you're undermining command authority. When you suggest modifications to established procedures, you're implying that our current protocols are inadequate. Emma felt the familiar weight of institutional resistance. The system that had grounded her because of her height was now limiting her contributions because of her rank and lack of flight experience. She was trapped in a bureaucratic paradox, too knowledgeable to ignore, but too unconventional to fully trust. Sir, what would you like me to do differently? Hayes consulted his notes again. Limit your recommendations to technical matters only. No tactical advice, no operational suggestions, no questioning of senior officers' decisions. Focus on aircraft, systems and maintenance issues, areas where your expertise is clearly valuable. Emma nodded professionally, but internally she was calculating the implications. Hayes was essentially asking her to ignore safety concerns that fell outside narrow technical boundaries. He wanted her knowledge, but only the parts that didn't challenge existing power structures. After the meeting, Emma walked across the base, toward the testing hangar where Major Cross was reviewing flight data from the morning's operations. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and heat waves distorted the F-22s lined up on the tarmac like sleeping predators. How did it go with Hayes? Cross asked without looking up from her computer screens. About as expected. I'm officially restricted to technical consultation, only no tactical recommendations, no operational input, no questioning senior officers. Cross finally looked up, her expression grim. That's what I was afraid of. Hayes is feeling pressure from above about your expanding role. Some officers at Pentagon level are concerned about setting precedents. What kind of precedents? The precedent of ground-based personnel influencing flight operations. The precedent of junior officers questioning senior pilots. The precedent of systematic analysis overriding experiential judgment. Cross paused meaningfully. The precedent of admitting that our current selection and training systems might be flawed. Emma sank into a chair beside Cross's workstation. So what happens now? Now you do what you've always done. You prepare. You study. You document everything. And you wait for the moment when preparation matters more than politics. Cross pulled up a classified report on her screen. Because that moment is coming, Sullivan. I've been analyzing incident patterns across all F-22 operations, and we're heading toward a crisis. Pilot overconfidence is increasing. Maintenance. Shortcuts are becoming routine, and training standards are slipping as the program expands. The data on Cross's screen was sobering. F-22 incidents had increased 34% over the past year, with pilot error accounting for 60% of cases. More concerning, the incidents were becoming more severe closer calls, more expensive damage, and narrower margins between problems and catastrophes. The aircraft is becoming a victim of its own reputation, Cross continued. Pilots think the F-22's advanced systems can compensate for poor judgment. They're taking risks they'd never take in older aircraft because they believe technology will save them. Emma studied the incident reports, recognizing patterns she'd been tracking in her own analysis. It's exactly what happened to Sophie. She trusted her natural ability and the aircraft's capabilities more than proper procedures. And it's what's going to happen to more pilots unless we change how the program operates. But changing institutional culture requires more than technical expertise. It requires someone willing to challenge the system when lives are at stake. Emma understood what Cross was implying. Despite Hayes's restrictions, despite the institutional resistance, despite her own limitations within the military hierarchy, she would need to continue pushing boundaries when safety demanded it. Major, can I ask you something? Of course. Why? Are you supporting me? You could have a much easier career by following conventional approaches and avoiding controversy. Cross was quiet for a long moment, staring at photographs of fallen pilots that decorated her office walls. Because 15 years ago, I lost my brother to the same kind of institutional blindness that killed your sister. He died because everyone assumed that experience trumped preparation, that natural ability mattered more than systematic knowledge. Cross turned to face Emma directly. The Air Force taught me to fly, but my brother's death taught me something more important, that preventing tragedies requires someone willing to be unpopular, someone willing to question authority, and someone willing to prepare for crises that others prefer to ignore. Emma felt a surge of determination that reminded her why she'd joined the military in the first place. Not for personal glory or career advancement, but to serve something larger than herself, to protect the pilots who protected the country. So we keep pushing forward. We keep preparing, Cross said firmly. Because somewhere in the near future, there's going to be a crisis that requires every piece of knowledge you've accumulated, every hour you've spent studying systems, and every principle you've learned about preparation versus presumption. Neither Emma nor Cross could have predicted that the crisis would come within 6 months, in the form of an experimental F-22 mission that would push both aircraft and pilot beyond their design limits, and that Emma's systematic preparation would become the only thing standing between a catastrophic failure and an international incident that could end the F-22 program forever. While Colonel Hayes had officially restricted Emma's role, Major Cross quietly expanded her responsibilities through unofficial channels. Emma found herself working longer hours, analyzing more data, and developing expertise that went far beyond technical consultation. She became the F-22 program's unofficial safety expert, the person everyone consulted when standard procedures weren't enough. Emma's daily routine reflected her obsessive approach to preparation. She arrived at the hangar by 0500 hours, spent 2 hours reviewing overnight maintenance reports and flight data from the previous day's operations. By 0700, she was conducting her systematic inspection of aircraft scheduled for morning flights. Documenting discrepancies that might escape standard pre-flight checks, the maintenance crews had learned to trust Emma's eye for detail. Technical. Sergeant Carlos Reeves often said that she could spot potential problems by listening to engine sounds that others couldn't even hear. Her inspection reports had prevented 3 major mechanical failures over the past 6 months, earning respect from ground personnel, even as some pilots remained skeptical of her contributions. Captain Sullivan called Lieutenant Jake Turner as he approached the F-22 she was examining. "Cross wants you to review today's test flight parameters. We're running the new avionics integration package." Emma looked up from the landing gear assembly she'd been inspecting. "What's the mission profile?" "High-altitude electromagnetic warfare simulation. We'll be testing the aircraft's stealth capabilities against advanced radar systems while running full combat loads." Turner paused, noting her expression. "Something wrong?" Emma's mind was already processing the implications. High-altitude operations with full combat loads created stress patterns that could reveal weaknesses in aircraft systems. The electromagnetic warfare component added another layer of complexity that could interfere with navigation and communication systems. "Who's the primary pilot?" "Bennett." Turner's voice carried a note of concern that matched Emma's growing unease. Emma had been tracking Captain Bennett's flight patterns for months, documenting a troubling trend toward increasingly aggressive tactics. Bennett was skilled enough to handle most situations, but his overconfidence led him to push aircraft beyond recommended parameters. In conventional fighters, such aggressive flying might result in equipment strain or minor accidents. In an F-22, the consequences could be catastrophic. "Jake, have you reviewed the electromagnetic interference data for today's test area?" Turner shook his head. Bennett said it was routine background noise, nothing that would affect aircraft systems. Emma felt her stomach tighten. She'd spent the previous evening analyzing electromagnetic patterns in the designated test area, identifying several anomalies that could potentially disrupt F-22 systems. Her report recommending flight path modifications had been submitted to Major Cross, but apparently it hadn't reached the primary pilot. "Can you get me 5 minutes with Bennett before his pre-flight briefing?" Turner hesitated. "Emma, you know how he feels about ground-based input. Hayes's new restrictions have made him even more resistant to outside suggestions. This isn't about challenging his authority. It's about aircraft safety." Turner studied Emma's expression, recognizing the intensity that appeared whenever she identified potential problems. Over the past year, he'd learned to take her concerns seriously, even when more experienced pilots dismissed them. "I'll see what I can do." 20 minutes later, Emma found herself in the briefing room where Bennett was reviewing flight charts with his wingmen. Lieutenant Alex Chen. Bennett looked up with obvious irritation when Emma entered. "Sullivan, unless there's a critical maintenance issue, I don't have time for ground-based theorizing." Emma placed a tablet on the table displaying electromagnetic analysis data. "Captain, I've identified potential interference patterns in today's test area that could affect navigation and communication systems during high-altitude operations." Bennett glanced at the data dismissively. "Those are standard electromagnetic readings for that region. We've flown through similar conditions at times without problems. Sir, the interference patterns show unusual harmonics that could interact with the F-22 stealth coding in unexpected ways. I recommend adjusting the flight path by 12 degrees north to avoid the strongest electromagnetic concentrations. Sullivan, I've been flying F-22s for 3 years. I understand how these aircraft respond to electromagnetic environments better than someone who's never been in the cockpit. Bennett's voice carried the edge of controlled anger. Your job is to analyze maintenance data, not to second-guess operational decisions made by qualified pilots. Lieutenant Chun looked between Emma and Bennett uncertainly. Mark, maybe we should consider. Chun, we're test pilots, not students, Bennett interrupted. Our job is to push these aircraft to their limits and beyond. If we avoided every theoretical concern raised by ground personnel, we'd never test anything meaningful. Emma felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed, despite having relevant expertise. But she'd learned to channel that frustration into more thorough documentation. If Bennett refused to consider her recommendations, she would ensure that her analysis was preserved for post-flight review. Captain, I'll document my concerns in the official flight record. If you encounter any navigation or communication anomalies during the mission, the interference data might help explain the cause. Fair enough, Bennett said curtly. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a real mission to prepare for. As Emma left the briefing room, she felt the weight of institutional limitations pressing down on her. She possessed information that could prevent problems, but the system prevented her from effectively communicating that information to the people who needed it. Emma spent the next hour in Major Cross's office, reviewing contingency plans for potential electromagnetic interference scenarios. Cross had learned to value Emma's systematic approach to problem identification, even when official protocols limited her authority to act on those insights. Bennett's flying today's electromagnetic warfare test, Emma reported. He dismissed my interference analysis as theoretical concerns. Cross looked up from her computer screen with concern. What's your assessment of actual risk levels? Moderate to high. The electromagnetic patterns could interfere with navigation systems during high-altitude maneuvers. Worst-case scenario involves loss of GPS guidance combined with communication disruption. And Bennett's likely response to such problems? Emma had studied Bennett's flying patterns long enough to predict his reactions with unsettling accuracy. He'll attempt to maintain mission parameters rather than abort for safety reasons. His overconfidence will make him believe he can overcome technical problems through superior flying skills. Cross was quiet for a moment, considering options within the constraints of military hierarchy and official protocols. Emma, I want you monitoring communications during today's flight. If Bennett encounters problems, I may need your technical expertise to guide recovery procedures. Ma'am, Hayes's restrictions prohibit me from providing operational guidance to active pilots. Hayes's restrictions don't apply to emergency situations, Cross replied firmly. If we have a pilot in distress, I'll use every available resource to bring him home safely regardless of official job descriptions. Emma felt a surge of purpose that reminded her why she'd chosen military service. Despite the bureaucratic obstacles, despite the institutional resistance, despite her own limitations within the system, she would be ready when preparation mattered. More than protocol data, she prepared to monitor Bennett's flight. Emma didn't know that she was about to witness the most dangerous F-22 incident in the program's history, an emergency that would test every principle she'd learned about systematic preparation, every hour she'd spent studying aircraft systems, and every sacrifice she'd made in pursuit of expertise that others considered unnecessary. The confrontation between overconfidence and preparation was about to unfold at 50,000 feet, with consequences that would reshape the entire F-22 program, and finally prove that Emma Sullivan's obsessive dedication to knowledge had been preparing her for this exact moment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At 1,347 hours, Captain Bennett's F-22 Raptor screamed through the Nevada sky at 52,000 feet, pushing Mach 1.8 while carrying a full complement of test equipment designed to evaluate the aircraft's stealth capabilities against advanced radar systems. The mission was proceeding flawlessly, exactly the kind of aggressive performance that had built Bennett's reputation as one of Holloman's most capable tests. Pilots. Emma monitored the flight from Holloman's command center, surrounded by banks of computers displaying real-time telemetry from Bennett's aircraft. Engine parameters showed green across all systems. Navigation was locked onto GPS satellites. Communication links remained crystal clear. Every indicator suggested a routine test flight that would validate the F-22's superiority in electromagnetic warfare environments. But Emma's systematic analysis revealed subtle anomalies that others missed. The electromagnetic interference she'd predicted was beginning to affect aircraft systems in ways that wouldn't become obvious until critical thresholds were exceeded. Navigation accuracy was degrading by microseconds. Communication signals showed faint harmonic distortions. Stealth coding effectiveness was fluctuating in patterns that suggested electromagnetic resonance. Falcon 7, this is Holloman Base, Major Cross transmitted to Bennett. How are you reading our signals? Crystal clear, Holloman. Bennett's voice crackled back through the speakers. All systems nominal. Beginning combat load maneuvers. At 5-2000. Emma watched her monitors with growing concern. The electromagnetic interference was building steadily, creating harmonic patterns that could overwhelm F-22 systems, designed for conventional electronic warfare environments. She'd predicted this exact scenario in her report, but Bennett had dismissed her concerns as theoretical overcaution. Major, Emma said quietly to Cross, the electromagnetic buildup is exceeding safe parameters. When Bennett's navigation systems are going to start experiencing significant drift within the next 8 minutes. Cross studied Emma's analysis displays, noting the steady progression toward critical interference levels. Can you predict when we'll reach failure thresholds? Emma's fingers danced across multiple keyboards, correlating real-time data with theoretical models she'd developed during months of systematic study. GPS navigation will fail first, probably within 6 to 8 minutes. Communication systems will start experiencing severe distortion 2 minutes later. If he's still in the high interference zone when both systems fail simultaneously, we lose contact with a $150 million aircraft carrying classified test equipment. Cross finished grimly. Through their headsets, they heard Bennett's voice reporting successful completion of the first series of maneuvers. His tone carried the confidence of a pilot who believed his skills could overcome any technical challenges the mission might present. Holloman Base, initiating high-G combat simulation. All systems performing beautifully up here. Emma watched her electromagnetic analysis screens with mounting dread. The interference patterns were approaching critical levels faster than her most pessimistic projections. Bennett was flying directly into an electromagnetic storm that could cripple his aircraft's most essential systems. Major, we need to recall him now, Emma urged. The interference buildup is accelerating beyond safe parameters. Cross hesitated, weighing Emma's technical analysis against Bennett's real-time flight experience. Military protocol favored the judgment of pilots actually flying the mission over ground-based theoretical concerns. Falcon 7, Holloman Base. We're detecting elevated electromagnetic activity in your operational area. Recommend you consider early mission termination. Negative, Holloman, Bennett responded immediately. All my instruments show normal readings. Electromagnetic levels are well within acceptable ranges for F-22 operations. Emma felt her heart rate spike. Bennett's instruments were calibrated for conventional electromagnetic environments, not the complex harmonic interference patterns she'd identified. His readings would appear normal until the moment they failed catastrophically. Major, his instruments can't detect the specific interference frequencies that affect F-22 systems. He's flying blind into a trap that his own cockpit displays can't warn him about. At 13:55 hours, Emma's predictions began materializing with terrifying precision. Bennett's GPS navigation suddenly shifted by 47 degrees, indicating his aircraft was hundreds of miles from its actual position. Warning lights flickered across his instrument panel as backup navigation systems struggled to compensate for the impossible readings. Holloman Base, I'm getting some unusual navigation anomalies. Bennett's voice carried the first hint of concern. GPS is showing conflicting position data. Emma leaned toward her microphone, but Cross stopped her with a raised hand. Official protocol required that communication with pilots come through designated channels, not ground-based consultants. Falcon 7, can you confirm your actual position using visual references? Bennett's response revealed the magnitude of the developing crisis. At 52,000 feet, surrounded by electromagnetic interference that was disrupting his communication systems, he had no visual references that could help determine his position. The F-22's advanced systems, designed to operate in any environment, were failing him precisely when he needed them most. Holloman, visual references are limited at this altitude. I'm seeing some kind of interference pattern on my radar displays. Recommend I descend to lower altitude for better navigation reference. Emma grabbed Cross's arm urgently. Major, if he descends while his navigation systems are compromised, he could fly into restricted airspace or commercial flight paths. The electromagnetic interference extends down to 30,000 feet in this region. Cross made a command decision that would later save Bennett's life and career. Captain Sullivan, guide me through the recovery procedure. I'll relay your instructions to Falcon 7. Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Everything she'd learned about F-22 systems, every hour she'd spent studying electromagnetic interference patterns, every principle she'd developed about systematic preparation, all of it was about to be tested in real-world conditions with life or death consequences. Falcon 7, Holloman Base. We're going to guide you through a systematic recovery procedure. First, switch to backup navigation mode and ignore all GPS readings. Roger, switching to backup navigation, Bennett replied, his voice tight with controlled tension. Emma watched her monitors as Bennett's aircraft responded to the navigation change. The electromagnetic interference was still building, but backup systems were less susceptible to the specific frequencies that had crippled his primary navigation. Next, reduce altitude to 45,000 and decrease speed to Mach 1.2, Emma instructed through Cross. The electromagnetic interference weakened significantly below 46,000 feet. Holloman, that puts me below optimal stealth envelope. I'll be visible to ground-based radar systems. Emma understood Bennett's reluctance. F-22 pilots were trained to maintain stealth advantages at all costs, even in training scenarios. But stealth capabilities meant nothing if the aircraft crashed due to navigation failure. Falcon 7, maintaining aircraft control is priority 1. Stealth considerations are secondary to safe recovery. As Bennett began his descent, Emma tracked the electromagnetic interference patterns on her screens. The good news was that interference levels were decreasing as predicted. The bad news was that Bennett's communication systems were still experiencing severe distortion that could lead to complete signal loss. Major, Emma said urgently, we're about to lose communication entirely. The next 60 seconds are critical for getting him oriented toward home base. Cross keyed her microphone immediately. Falcon 7, you need to establish heading 270 degrees immediately. You have approximately 1 minute before we lose communication capability. Roger, turning to heading 270, Bennett acknowledged, his voice already beginning To fade through increasing static. Emma watched Bennett's aircraft icon on her tracking screen as it turned toward Holloman Air Force Base. The electromagnetic interference was still dangerous, but if her calculations were correct, he should regain full navigation and communication capabilities within 15 minutes. The question was whether Bennett would trust the systematic recovery procedure Emma had developed, or whether his natural pilot instincts would lead him to attempt solutions that could make the crisis worse. At 52,000 feet, flying a $150 million aircraft through an electromagnetic storm that had already disabled his primary systems, Captain Bennett was about to discover whether Emma Sullivan's obsessive preparation was worth more than his years of flight experience. For 17 agonizing minutes, Holloman's command center fell into radio silence. Emma stared at her electromagnetic interference monitors, watching the patterns that had crippled Bennett's aircraft slowly dissipate as he descended through altitude layers. Her calculations indicated that communication should return at 43,000 feet, but those calculations had never been tested under real-world conditions, with an actual pilot's life at stake. "Come on, Bennett," Major Cross muttered, scanning radio frequencies for any sign of Falcon 7's transmission. "Give us something." Emma's fingers moved across her keyboard, fine-tuning the electromagnetic analysis displays. She could track Bennett's approximate position through radar signatures, but without direct communication, she had no way of knowing whether he was following her recovery procedures or attempting his own solutions to the navigation crisis. At 14-12 hours, Bennett's voice crackled through the static like a miracle. "Holloman Base, Falcon 7. I'm at 43,000, heading 270 as instructed. Navigation systems are ... stabilizing. How copy?" Emma felt relief flood through her chest, but she knew the crisis wasn't over. Bennett had successfully descended below the worst electromagnetic interference, but his F-22 was still operating with compromised systems in unfamiliar conditions. "Falcon 7, Holloman Base. We copy you 5x5, Cross responded immediately. "What's your current system status?" "Primary navigation is still unreliable. Backup systems are functional, but showing position errors. I've got partial radar coverage and intermittent communication." Bennett paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a note Emma had never heard before: uncertainty. "Holloman, I need guidance for safe recovery to base." Emma realized that for the first time in his F-22 career, Captain Bennett was acknowledging that his natural flying ability wasn't sufficient to handle the situation. The electromagnetic interference had created conditions beyond anything covered in standard pilot training, forcing him to rely on systematic technical knowledge rather than experiential judgment. "Falcon 7, we're going to guide you through a step-by-step recovery procedure," Cross transmitted. "Our technical team has analyzed your current electromagnetic environment and developed specific protocols for your situation." Emma appreciated Cross's diplomatic phrasing. By referring to "our technical team" rather than naming Emma specifically, Cross avoided highlighting the fact that Bennett was receiving guidance from the ground-based consultant he'd dismissed just hours earlier. "Roger, Holloman. I'm ready for your guidance." Emma leaned toward her microphone, finally able to put her systematic preparation to direct use. "Falcon 7, switch your primary display to manual navigation mode. We need to establish your position using triangulation from known radar installations." "Manual navigation?" Bennett's voice carried surprise. "I haven't used manual nav procedures since basic training." "Sir, your GPS systems are still recovering from electromagnetic interference. Manual navigation will give us accurate positioning while your primary systems recalibrate." Emma guided Bennett through a series of procedures that most F-22 pilots had never used in actual flight operations. Modern fighter aircraft relied heavily on automated systems, GPS guidance, and computer-assisted navigation. Manual procedures were considered backup techniques for extreme emergencies, exactly the kind of situation Bennett now faced. Okay, Holloman, I'm reading bearing 315 from Nellis installation. Bearing 227 from Creech installation. That puts me approximately ... Bennett paused, performing calculations that had once been routine for military pilots, but had become obsolete in the age of GPS automation. Falcon 7, your position is 37 miles northeast of Holloman. Bearing 045 from base, Emma calculated instantly. Turn to heading 225 and maintain current altitude until we can verify your navigation systems are fully operational. As Bennett adjusted his course toward home base, Emma monitored his aircraft systems through real-time telemetry links. The electromagnetic interference was continuing to dissipate, but recovery was proceeding more slowly than her theoretical models had predicted. Bennett would need careful guidance for at least another 20 minutes before his F-22 systems returned to normal operation. Holloman, I'm showing gradual improvement in navigation accuracy, Bennett reported. But I'm still getting intermittent warnings from systems I've never seen fail before. Emma understood Bennett's confusion. The F-22's advanced computer systems were designed to operate flawlessly in virtually any environment. Pilots weren't trained to handle the kind of systematic failures that electromagnetic interference could cause because such failures were considered virtually impossible. Falcon 7, those warnings are normal responses to electromagnetic recovery. Your aircraft's computers are recalibrating to account for interference-induced errors. The warning should clear as you continue descending toward base. Copy that, Holloman, and thank you for the guidance. I've never encountered anything like this electromagnetic situation. Emma felt a moment of vindication that she'd been waiting for throughout her entire military career. Captain Bennett, the pilot who dismissed her expertise as theoretical overthinking, was now depending on that same expertise for his survival, but Emma's satisfaction was tempered by professional concern. Bennett's near disaster revealed fundamental problems with F-22 training and operational procedures. Pilots weren't prepared for electromagnetic warfare environments that could disable their advanced systems. Training programs focused on aircraft capabilities rather than limitations. Emergency procedures assumed that backup systems would always function normally. Major, Emma said quietly to Cross, this incident exposes serious gaps in our pilot preparation. Bennett is one of our most experienced F-22 pilots, but he had no idea how to handle systematic navigation failure. Cross nodded grimly. How many other pilots do you think would have handled this situation better? Emma considered the question carefully. She'd been analyzing pilot training records and performance data for months, identifying patterns that suggested widespread over-reliance on automated systems. Honestly, maybe 2 or 3 pilots on this entire base have sufficient manual navigation skills to handle what Bennett just experienced. The rest would have been in serious trouble. And if this had happened during an actual combat mission instead of a training exercise, the implications were sobering. A combat pilot experiencing navigation failure in hostile territory, without the luxury of ground-based guidance and careful recovery procedures, would face life-threatening dangers that could compromise both pilot safety and mission success. Major, we need to completely revise F-22 training protocols. Pilots need to practice manual navigation, electromagnetic interference recovery, and systematic failure procedures that current training programs don't even cover. Cross was already thinking ahead to the inevitable investigation and review process that would follow Bennett's incident. Emma, I want you to prepare a comprehensive analysis of today's events. Document everything: the electromagnetic interference patterns you predicted, the systematic failures that occurred, the recovery procedures that worked, and the training gaps that this incident revealed. Yes, ma'am. But Major, there's something else we need to consider. What's that? Emma gestured. toward her electromagnetic analysis displays, which still showed residual interference patterns throughout the test area. The electromagnetic environment that caused Bennett's problems isn't unique to today's location. Similar interference patterns exist near several other military installations and training areas. We could have pilots encountering these same problems at other bases without anyone available who understands the recovery procedures. Cross felt a chill as she realized the broader implications of Emma's analysis. Bennett's near disaster might not be an isolated incident. It could be the first symptom of a systemic problem that threatened F-22 operations across the entire Air Force. "Captain Sullivan," Cross said formally, "I'm authorizing you to expand your analysis beyond today's incident. I want you to identify every location where similar electromagnetic interference could affect F-22 operations, and I want recommendations for preventing future incidents." As Bennett's F-22 finally appeared on the horizon, approaching Holloman for what would become the most important landing of his career, Emma realized that her role was about to change dramatically. The quiet technical consultant who'd been restricted to maintenance analysis was about to become the Air Force's leading expert on F-22 electromagnetic vulnerability, whether the institutional hierarchy was ready for that change or not. Captain Bennett's F-22 touched down at Holloman Air Force Base at 14:47 hours with textbook precision. But the perfect landing couldn't hide the magnitude of what had nearly become a catastrophic loss. As the Raptor taxied toward the maintenance hangar, Emma watched from the command center windows, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether her systematic approach to aircraft safety would finally be recognized or whether institutional politics would bury the lessons of Bennett's near disaster. Colonel Robert Hayes arrived at the command center within minutes of Bennett's landing, his face grim with the realization that a routine test flight had nearly resulted in the loss of a $150 million aircraft and one of his most experienced pilots. Hayes had built his career on maintaining perfect safety records, and Bennett's incident threatened to attract exactly the kind of attention that could end military careers. "Major Cross, I want a full briefing on today's incident in my office." "In 30 minutes, Hayes announced tersely. "I need to understand exactly what went wrong and why our standard procedures failed to prevent it." Emma felt her stomach tighten as she realized that Hayes was already framing the incident as a failure of existing procedures, rather than a validation of her electromagnetic interference predictions. The institutional tendency to protect established protocols was about to clash with the evidence that systematic preparation had prevented disaster. "Sir," Cross replied carefully, "Captain Sullivan's electromagnetic analysis provided the critical guidance that enabled safe recovery. Her predictions about interference patterns proved completely accurate." Hayes's expression hardened. Captain Sullivan was specifically instructed to limit her contributions to technical maintenance issues. Operational guidance during flight operations exceeds her authorized responsibilities. Emma felt the familiar weight of bureaucratic resistance, but this time the stakes were different. Bennett's life had depended on her systematic preparation, and that fact couldn't be dismissed or minimized to protect institutional comfort levels. "Colonel," Emma said quietly, "my electromagnetic analysis identified the exact conditions that caused Captain Bennett's navigation failures. Without that analysis, the recovery procedures would have been impossible to develop. Captain, your analysis may have been accurate, but you provided operational guidance to an active pilot without proper authorization. That's a violation of the restrictions I placed on your role." Before Emma could respond, Captain Bennett himself entered the command center, still wearing his flight suit and carrying his helmet. His face showed the strain of the harrowing flight, but his expression was resolute as he approached Hayes. "Colonel, I need to report on today's incident," Bennett began formally. "At 13:55 hours, I experienced total navigation system failure due to electromagnetic interference that Captain Sullivan had specifically predicted in her Pre-flight analysis. Hayes looked surprised. Captain, I wasn't aware that you had reviewed Sullivan's electromagnetic analysis. Sir, I dismissed her analysis as theoretical overcaution during the pre-flight briefing. That decision nearly cost me my aircraft and potentially my life. Bennett paused, choosing his words carefully. Captain Sullivan's systematic preparation and technical expertise provided the only effective response to a crisis that standard pilot training hadn't prepared me to handle. Emma felt a surge of gratitude toward Bennett, recognizing the professional courage it took for an experienced pilot to publicly acknowledge that he'd been wrong and that a ground-based consultant had saved his career. Furthermore, Bennett continued, Captain Sullivan's guidance revealed serious gaps in F-22 training protocols. I had no idea how to handle systematic navigation failure because we're not trained for scenarios where our advanced systems become liabilities rather than assets. Hayes was clearly uncomfortable with Bennett's assessment, but he couldn't dismiss the testimony of one of his most senior pilots. Captain Bennett, are you suggesting that our current training programs are inadequate? Sir, I'm stating that. Without Captain Sullivan's expertise, today's incident would have resulted in aircraft loss and potentially pilot casualty. Our training programs don't prepare pilots for electromagnetic warfare environments that can disable F-22 systems. Major Cross seized the moment to reinforce Bennett's testimony. Colonel, Captain Sullivan has been documenting these training gaps for months. Her analysis shows that electromagnetic interference scenarios represent a significant vulnerability that current protocols don't address. Emma realized that the conversation was reaching a critical juncture. Hayes could either acknowledge the value of her systematic approach and authorize expanded safety analysis, or he could maintain institutional resistance and risk future incidents that might be far more catastrophic. Colonel Hayes, Emma said carefully, I've identified 17 locations where similar electromagnetic interference could affect F-22 operations. Today's incident may be the first of many unless we develop comprehensive countermeasures and training protocols. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, weighing the implications of Emma's warning against his preference for maintaining established procedures. Finally, he looked directly at Bennett. Captain, in your professional judgment, would today's incident have been preventable with different pre-flight analysis and preparation? Absolutely, sir. Captain Sullivan identified the exact electromagnetic conditions that caused my system failures. If I had followed her recommendations for flight path modification, the incident would never have occurred. And her recovery guidance during the emergency? Sir, without Captain Sullivan's systematic understanding of F-22 electromagnetic vulnerability, I would have been forced to attempt emergency procedures that could have made the situation much worse. Her technical expertise was the only reason I was able to safely return to base. Hayes finally turned to Emma, his expression showing grudging recognition of facts he could no longer ignore. Captain Sullivan, it appears that your systematic approach to aircraft analysis has proven more valuable than anyone anticipated. Emma felt a moment of vindication, but she knew that institutional change required more than acknowledgement. It required actionable commitment to different procedures and priorities. Sir, preventing future incidents will require fundamental changes to F-22 training protocols, electromagnetic interference assessment procedures, and pilot preparation standards. The changes won't be popular with pilots who prefer traditional approaches. Explain what you mean by fundamental changes. Emma pulled out a tablet displaying the comprehensive analysis she'd been developing for months. Pilots need training in manual navigation procedures, electromagnetic interference recognition, systematic failure recovery, and decision-making. Protocols that prioritize aircraft preservation over mission completion. Bennett nodded agreement. Colonel, everything Captain Sullivan is describing represents knowledge that could have prevented today's crisis. The training gaps she's identified are real, and they're dangerous. Hayes studied the analysis Emma presented, recognizing the thoroughness and systematic thinking that characterized all her work. Despite his institutional preferences, he couldn't ignore evidence that suggested current procedures were inadequate for emerging operational environments. Captain Sullivan, I'm authorizing you to develop a comprehensive F-22 electromagnetic vulnerability assessment program. You'll have full access to flight data, maintenance records, and training protocols. Your mandate is to identify and address every scenario that could replicate today's incident. Emma felt a surge of purpose that reminded her why she dedicated her career to systematic preparation. After years of working in the shadows, restricted by bureaucratic limitations and institutional resistance, she finally had the authority to implement the safety improvements that could prevent tragedies like Sophie's death. Thank you, sir. I'll have preliminary recommendations ready within 2 weeks. As the meeting concluded and Hayes departed to brief his superiors on the incident, Emma realized that Bennett's near disaster had accomplished something that years of systematic analysis and professional competence had been unable to achieve. The crisis had forced institutional recognition that preparation and knowledge mattered more than rank, experience, or traditional approaches to pilot development. But Emma also knew that her expanded authority would bring new challenges and resistance. From officers who preferred conventional methods, the quiet consultant was about to become a visible advocate for changes that would challenge fundamental assumptions about how the Air Force trained and equipped its most elite pilots. Within 48 hours of Bennett's electromagnetic crisis, word of Emma's life-saving expertise had spread throughout Holloman Air Force Base and beyond. Pilots who had previously dismissed her as an overzealous ground-based consultant now sought her analysis of their own flight plans. Maintenance crews requested her input on system anomalies they'd previously handled through standard troubleshooting procedures. Most significantly, Colonel Hayes found himself fielding calls from Pentagon officials who wanted to understand how a captain with no official flight experience had developed the expertise to save an F-22, and its first major challenge came from an unexpected source: the Air Force's F-22 Training Command. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Morrison, responsible for pilot education across all F-22 installations, arrived at Holloman 3 days after Bennett's incident with a mandate to evaluate Emma's proposed training modifications. Captain Sullivan, Morrison began during their first meeting. I've reviewed your electromagnetic vulnerability assessment and your recommendations for training protocol changes. While your technical analysis appears sound, I'm concerned about the practical implications of implementing your suggestions. Emma had prepared for this conversation, knowing that proposing fundamental changes to established training programs would encounter institutional resistance. Morrison represented the systematized thinking that had created current F-22 pilot education, a system that emphasized aircraft capabilities over limitations and pilot confidence over systematic preparation. Ma'am, could you specify which practical implications concern you most? Morrison consulted a thick folder of documentation. Your recommendations would require an additional 120 hours of training per pilot, covering manual navigation, electromagnetic interference recognition, and systematic failure recovery. That represents a 40% increase in training time and costs. Yes, ma'am. But those 120 hours would prepare pilots for scenarios that current training doesn't. Address scenarios that could result in aircraft loss and pilot casualties. Captain, we've been training F-22 pilots successfully for over a decade. Our safety record has been exemplary until very recently. I'm not convinced that isolated incidents justify complete overhaul of proven training methods. Emma recognized the logic that had kept her grounded for years. If current methods had worked adequately in the past, why risk changes that might introduce new problems? It was the institutional thinking that prioritized continuity over improvement, even when evidence suggested that improvement was necessary. Ma'am, Captain Bennett's incident wasn't isolated. My analysis shows that 17 other F-22 flights have experienced navigation anomalies in electromagnetic interference environments over the past 18 months. Those incidents were classified as equipment malfunctions rather than training deficiencies. Morrison looked surprised. You have documentation of 17 similar incidents? Emma opened her laptop, displaying a comprehensive database she'd compiled during months of systematic analysis. Each entry documented flight anomalies, electromagnetic conditions, pilot responses, and recovery procedures. The pattern was clear. F-22 pilots regularly encountered situations that their training hadn't prepared them to handle. The difference between these incidents and Captain Bennett's crisis was the severity of electromagnetic interference and the availability of ground-based technical support. In combat environments, pilots won't have either advantage. Morrison studied Emma's data for several minutes, recognizing the thoroughness and systematic thinking that characterized all her work. Captain, assuming your analysis is accurate, what you're describing suggests fundamental flaws in our entire approach to F-22 pilot development. Ma'am, I'm describing the difference between training pilots to use aircraft capabilities and training pilots to understand aircraft limitations. Current programs focus almost exclusively on what F-22s can do, not on what can go wrong or how to recover when systems fail. The conversation was interrupted by Captain Bennett's arrival. Morrison had requested his perspective on Emma's training recommendations, recognizing that pilot testimony would carry more weight than ground-based analysis. Colonel Morrison, Bennett began formally. I've flown F-22s for 3 years without encountering any situation that standard training hadn't prepared me to handle. Captain Sullivan's electromagnetic crisis taught me that my confidence was based on incomplete preparation. How do you mean, incomplete preparation? Bennett chose his words carefully, knowing that his assessment would influence decisions affecting F-22 training across the entire Air Force. Ma'am, I believe that advanced aircraft systems would compensate for any problems I might encounter. When those systems failed simultaneously, I had no backup procedures or systematic understanding of how to recover. And Captain Sullivan's proposed training modifications would have prepared you differently. Absolutely. Manual navigation procedures, electromagnetic interference recognition, systematic failure recovery, every technique she used to guide me home safely represents knowledge that current training programs don't provide. Morrison was beginning to understand the implications of Emma's analysis. If Bennett's experience was representative, the Air Force was deploying F-22 pilots who possessed impressive technical skills but lacked the systematic preparation necessary for handling complex emergencies. Captain Sullivan, your training modifications would essentially require pilots to master backup procedures for every advanced system on the aircraft. Yes, ma'am. The F-22's advanced capabilities become vulnerabilities when pilots don't understand how to operate without them. Morrison nodded slowly, recognizing the logic of Emma's approach. And you believe this systematic preparation is more important than the additional flight hours that pilots could spend practicing standard maneuvers. Emma thought about Sophie's accident, about the overconfidence that had killed her sister, about the institutional thinking that prioritized performance over preparation. Ma'am, systematic preparation is what keeps pilots alive when performance isn't enough. Over the following week, Morrison observed Emma's work directly, attending briefings where she analyzed flight data, reviewed maintenance reports, and identified potential problems that others missed. Morrison watched Emma guide pilots through electromagnetic interference scenarios, teach manual navigation procedures that most officers had forgotten, and demonstrate systematic thinking that transformed how pilots understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations. The breakthrough came when Morrison participated in a flight simulator exercise that Emma had designed to replicate Bennett's electromagnetic crisis. Morrison, despite her extensive F-22 experience, found herself unable to recover from the systematic navigation failures that Emma's scenario created. "Captain," Morrison said after the simulation, "I just experienced exactly what Bennett described. Without the systematic preparation you're recommending, I would have been completely helpless in that electromagnetic environment." Emma felt a surge of hope as she realized that Morrison was beginning to understand the fundamental difference between conventional pilot training and the systematic preparation that prevented tragedies. "Ma'am, every pilot who experiences that simulation reaches the same conclusion. Advanced aircraft require more sophisticated backup procedures, not less." Morrison made a decision that would ultimately reshape F-22 training across the Air Force. "Captain Sullivan, I'm recommending immediate implementation of your training modifications at all F-22 installations. The electromagnetic vulnerability you've identified represents a genuine threat to pilot safety and aircraft preservation." Emma felt the satisfaction of knowing that her systematic approach was finally being recognized, not as theoretical overcaution, but as essential preparation for keeping pilots alive. But she also knew that implementing changes across the entire F-22 program would require confronting resistance from officers who preferred traditional methods and pilots who believed their experience was sufficient preparation for any challenge. The quiet consultant who'd spent years studying aircraft and hangars was about to become the architect of fundamental changes to how the Air Force's most elite pilots were trained and prepared for combat. The transformation would validate everything Emma had learned about the relationship between systematic preparation and survival, but it would also test her ability to overcome institutional inertia that had resisted change for decades. Emma Sullivan was about to discover that changing minds was harder than saving lives, but that both required the same systematic preparation that had defined her entire military career. 6 weeks after Bennett's electromagnetic crisis, Emma found herself sitting in a Pentagon conference room facing a panel of senior Air Force officials who would determine the future of F-22 training protocols and her own military career. The formal review board included General Victoria Stone, the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, along with 4 colonels representing different aspects of F-22 program management. The meeting had been called because Emma's proposed training modifications had created controversy throughout the fighter pilot community. Traditional pilots argued that her systematic approach would produce overly cautious aviators who lacked the aggressive instincts necessary for air combat. Progressive officers countered that Emma's methods would create more competent pilots who understood their aircraft's true capabilities and limitations. "Captain Sullivan," General Stone began, consulting a thick folder of documentation, "your electromagnetic vulnerability assessment has generated significant discussion within F-22 training circles. Some officers view your recommendations as essential safety improvements. Others see them as unnecessary complications that could undermine pilot confidence and combat effectiveness." Emma had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that her systematic approach to aircraft safety would be evaluated by officers who had built their careers on traditional methods. She understood that the review represented more than an assessment of training protocols. It was a test of whether the Air Force could adapt its institutional thinking to address evolving operational challenges. "General, my recommendations are based on systematic analysis of F-22 electromagnetic vulnerability and documented incidents where pilots encountered situations that current training hadn't prepared them to handle." Colonel David Park, representing F-22 operational squadrons, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Captain, your analysis focuses heavily on worst-case scenarios that may never occur in actual combat situations. Are you suggesting that we should train pilots to expect system failures rather than teaching them to maximize aircraft capabilities?" Emma recognized the fundamental misunderstanding that had characterized resistance to her approach throughout. Her career. Traditional thinking viewed preparation for problems as pessimistic overcaution rather than practical readiness. Sir, I'm suggesting that we train pilots to understand both capabilities and limitations. Captain Bennett's incident demonstrated that even experienced pilots can encounter situations where advanced systems become liabilities rather than assets. But Bennett's incident was caused by unusual electromagnetic conditions that pilots wouldn't normally encounter, Park countered. Should we redesign our entire training program around exceptional circumstances? Emma opened her laptop, displaying the comprehensive database she'd compiled over months of systematic analysis. Colonel, MY research shows that electromagnetic interference scenarios occur more frequently than anyone previously understood. 17 documented incidents in 18 months, with increasing frequency as F-22 operations expand into electronically contested environments. General Stone studied Emma's data with growing interest. Captain, are you saying that what we've classified as isolated equipment malfunctions are actually predictable responses to electromagnetic conditions? Yes, ma'am. The F-22's advanced systems are vulnerable to specific interference frequencies that can disable navigation, communication, and targeting capabilities simultaneously. Current training programs don't prepare pilots for scenarios where multiple systems fail at once. Colonel Morrison, who had become one of Emma's strongest advocates after witnessing her simulator exercises, provided crucial support. General, I've observed Captain Sullivan's training modifications in action. Pilots who complete her electromagnetic interference scenarios demonstrate significantly better decision-making under stress and more systematic approaches to emergency recovery. The discussion was interrupted by an unexpected arrival, Captain Bennett himself, who had been called to testify about his electromagnetic crisis and Emma's role in his recovery. Bennett's presence added weight to the proceedings, as his experience represented the real-world validation of Emma's theoretical analysis. Captain Bennett, General Stone addressed him directly. Please describe your experience with the electromagnetic interference incident and Captain Sullivan's contribution to your safe recovery. Bennett spoke with the precision and authority that came from genuine flight experience. General, at 13:55 hours on the day in question, I experienced total navigation system failure due to electromagnetic interference that Captain Sullivan had specifically predicted in her pre-flight analysis. And you had dismissed her analysis as unnecessary caution? Yes, ma'am. I believed that my flight experience and the F-22's advanced systems would be sufficient to handle any problems that might arise. That assumption nearly cost me my aircraft, and potentially my life. General Stone made notes as Bennett continued his testimony. Captain, how did Captain Sullivan's systematic preparation enable your recovery? Ma'am, Captain Sullivan's understanding of F-22 electromagnetic vulnerability provided the only effective response to conditions that standard pilot training hadn't prepared me to handle. Her technical expertise included manual navigation procedures, interference recognition protocols, and systematic recovery techniques that aren't covered in current F-22 training programs. Colonel Park pressed Bennett for more specific details. Captain, are you suggesting that standard F-22 training is inadequate for preparing pilots for electromagnetic warfare environments? Bennett chose his words carefully, knowing that his assessment would influence training protocols for hundreds of future F-22 pilots. Sir, standard training prepares pilots to use F-22 capabilities effectively, but it doesn't prepare pilots to operate when those capabilities are compromised. Captain Sullivan's systematic approach fills critical gaps in pilot preparation. Emma felt vindicated by Bennett's testimony, but she knew that institutional change required more than individual endorsements. The review board needed to understand that her systematic preparation represented a fundamentally different approach to pilot development, one that prioritized comprehensive readiness over confident performance. General, Emma said during a pause in the questioning. The electromagnetic vulnerability I've documented represents just one example of how rapidly changing operational environments challenge traditional training methods. Future combat scenarios will likely include directed energy weapons, advanced electronic warfare systems, and cyber attacks that could disable F-22 systems in ways that current training doesn't address. General Stone looked intrigued. Captain, are you suggesting that your systematic approach to electromagnetic interference could be applied to other emerging threats? Yes, ma'am. The fundamental principle, understanding aircraft limitations as thoroughly as capabilities, applies to any scenario where advanced systems might fail or be compromised by enemy action. Colonel Morrison reinforced Emma's point. General, Captain Sullivan's methods have already identified vulnerability scenarios that are standard threat assessments missed entirely. Her systematic thinking process could revolutionize how we prepare pilots for evolving combat environments. General Stone studied the assembled evidence for several minutes before reaching her conclusion. Captain Sullivan, your electromagnetic vulnerability assessment has revealed significant gaps in F-22 training protocols. Your systematic approach to aircraft limitations appears to complement rather than compete with traditional emphasis on aircraft capabilities. Emma felt hope building as she recognized that General Stone was beginning to understand the value of systematic preparation. Furthermore, Stone continued, Captain Bennett's testimony demonstrates that your theoretical analysis translates directly into life-saving practical applications. The Air Force needs officers who can bridge the gap between academic knowledge and operational reality. Colonel Park made one final attempt to defend traditional approaches. General, implementing Captain Sullivan's recommendations would require fundamental changes to training programs that have successfully produced F-22 pilots for over a decade. General Stone's response would determine whether Emma's systematic preparation became standard practice or remained an experimental curiosity. Colonel, Captain Sullivan's analysis suggests that our definition of successful pilot production may be incomplete. If we're deploying pilots who can't handle electromagnetic interference scenarios, we're not preparing them for the full spectrum of threats they may encounter. Emma realized that the review board was reaching a critical decision point that would validate either traditional confidence-based training or her systematic preparation-based approach. Everything she'd learned about the relationship between knowledge and survival was about to be tested at the highest levels of Air Force decision-making. General Victoria Stone closed the comprehensive review folder and looked directly at Emma with an expression that revealed nothing about the board's decision. The Pentagon conference room fell silent as 4 colonels and 1 captain waited for a determination that would affect F-22 operations across the entire Air Force. Captain Sullivan, General Stone began formally. This review board has evaluated your electromagnetic vulnerability assessment, your proposed training modifications, and the testimony of officers who have worked with your systematic preparation methods. Emma felt her heart rate increase as she realized that years of systematic preparation, months of documentation, and weeks of institutional review were about to be distilled into a single decision that would either validate her approach or end her influence on F-22 safety protocols. Your analysis has revealed significant gaps in our current training programs, Stone continued. More importantly, your systematic approach to aircraft limitations has proven capable of preventing incidents that could result in aircraft loss and pilot casualties. Colonel Park shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that his defense of traditional training methods was about to be overruled by evidence that systematic preparation produced measurably better results. Therefore, General Stone announced, I am authorizing immediate implementation of your electromagnetic vulnerability training protocols at all F-22 installations. Additionally, you are promoted to Major and assigned as Director of Advanced Threat Assessment for the F-22 program. Emma felt a surge of vindication so powerful that she had to concentrate to maintain professional composure. After years of being told that her systematic preparation was unnecessary overcaution, she was being placed in charge of preparing F-22 pilots for threats that traditional training had ignored. Furthermore, Stone continued, your systematic approach to identifying aircraft vulnerabilities will be expanded beyond electromagnetic threats. The Air Force needs comprehensive assessment of how emerging technologies could compromise F-22 operations. Captain Bennett, who had remained silent during most of the review proceedings, spoke with obvious satisfaction. General, Major Sullivan's systematic preparation saved my life and my aircraft. Every F-22 pilot deserves the same level of protection that her methods provide. Colonel Morrison added her support. Ma'am, implementing Major Sullivan's training modifications will require significant resources and institutional commitment, but the alternative is deploying pilots who aren't prepared for modern threat environments. Emma understood that her promotion and expanded authority represented more than personal vindication. It validated the principle that systematic preparation could overcome institutional resistance when lives were at stake. The Air Force was officially acknowledging that knowledge and thorough analysis mattered more than rank, experience, or traditional approaches to pilot development. Major Sullivan, General Stone addressed her with her new rank. Your first assignment will be developing comprehensive threat assessment protocols for F-22 operations in contested, electronic environments. You'll have access to classified intelligence about emerging enemy capabilities and authorization to modify training programs as necessary. Emma realized that she was being given the authority to implement every safety improvement she'd been developing during her years as a restricted consultant. The systematic approach that had saved Bennett's life would now protect hundreds of F-22 pilots facing similar threats. Thank you, General. I'll begin comprehensive vulnerability assessment immediately. General Stone gathered her papers, signaling the end of the formal review. Major, the Air Force is changing how we think about pilot preparation because your systematic approach has proven more effective than traditional methods. Don't let us down. As the review board members departed, Emma found herself alone with Captain Bennett, who had become her most credible advocate throughout the institutional evaluation process. Major Sullivan, Bennett said with a smile, I owe you an apology. That's about 6 months overdue. I spent years dismissing your expertise as theoretical overcaution when you were actually developing the knowledge that would save my life. Emma felt the satisfaction of professional recognition, but also the weight of responsibility that came with her expanded authority. Captain, your willingness to acknowledge the value of systematic preparation made this institutional change possible. Most pilots wouldn't have admitted that their training was incomplete. Most pilots haven't experienced electromagnetic interference at 52,000 feet with failing navigation systems. Bennett replied, that kind of crisis teaches you the difference between confidence and competence very quickly. Emma understood that Bennett's transformation from skeptical critic to strong advocate represented exactly the kind of institutional change that her systematic approach was designed to achieve. Individual excellence wasn't enough. The entire system needed to prioritize preparation over presumption. Over the following weeks, Emma threw herself into her new role with characteristic intensity. She developed comprehensive electromagnetic threat assessment protocols, created training scenarios that challenged pilot assumptions about F-22 invulnerability, and established systematic procedures for identifying emerging vulnerabilities before they caused incidents. Her first major success came when her threat assessment identified potential cyber vulnerabilities in F-22 communication systems. Her analysis revealed that enemy hackers could potentially disrupt pilot-to-ground communication in ways that standard cybersecurity protocols didn't address. The discovery led to immediate modifications of F-22 Communication systems and additional training for pilots in communication denied environments. Emma's systematic approach was beginning to reshape how the Air Force thought about F-22 capabilities and limitations. Instead of viewing the aircraft as an invulnerable technological marvel, pilots were learning to understand both its strengths and its potential weaknesses. Major Cross, who had supported Emma throughout her journey from restricted consultant to program director, observed the transformation with professional satisfaction. "Emma, you've accomplished something that most officers never achieve. You've changed institutional thinking through systematic preparation and demonstrated competence." Emma felt gratitude toward Cross, recognizing that her mentor's support had been crucial during the years when institutional resistance threatened to bury her contributions. "Major, you taught me that preventing tragedies requires someone willing to be unpopular and systematic, even when others prefer comfortable assumptions. And now you're teaching that lesson to hundreds of F-22 pilots who will face threats that previous generations never imagined." As Emma reviewed intelligence reports about emerging electromagnetic warfare capabilities, she realized that her systematic approach to aircraft vulnerability was more relevant than ever. Enemy nations were developing sophisticated electronic warfare systems, specifically designed to disrupt advanced fighter aircraft like the F-22. The knowledge and preparation that had saved Captain Bennett's life were about to become essential survival skills for every F-22 pilot facing modern combat environments. Emma's transformation from overlooked consultant to program director represented more than personal vindication. It demonstrated that systematic preparation could overcome any institutional resistance when the stakes were high enough. Emma Sullivan had spent years proving that being too short to fly didn't prevent her from understanding aircraft better than pilots who could. Now she was proving that systematic knowledge could reshape an entire program's approach to pilot safety and combat readiness. The height restriction that had defined her limitations had become irrelevant compared to the expertise that defined her contributions. Emma had finally achieved the recognition that her systematic preparation deserved. But more importantly, she had created systems that would prevent other pilots from experiencing the kind of preventable tragedies that had claimed her sister Sophie's life. 18 months after Captain Bennett's electromagnetic crisis, Major Emma Sullivan stood in the Advanced Flight Training Facility at Holloman Air Force Base, watching a group of F-22 pilot candidates practice the systematic preparation techniques that had become known throughout the Air Force as the Sullivan Standard. The transformation was remarkable. Pilots, who once viewed ground-based analysis as theoretical distraction, now treated comprehensive threat assessment as essential survival training. Major Sullivan called Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes one of Emma's newest students. "The electromagnetic interference scenario you designed yesterday revealed vulnerabilities in our communication backup procedures. Should we modify the recovery protocols?" Emma felt satisfaction in Hayes's question, recognizing the systematic thinking that now characterized F-22 pilot preparation. Instead of assuming that advanced systems would always function properly, pilots were learning to identify potential failure modes and develop comprehensive countermeasures. "Lieutenant, what specific vulnerabilities did you identify?" Hayes consulted detailed notes that reflected the systematic documentation Emma required from all her students. "Ma'am, when primary communication fails during electromagnetic interference, our backup radio frequencies become overloaded with pilots attempting simultaneous contact. The result is communication chaos rather than organized recovery." "Excellent analysis. What solutions would you recommend?" "Staggered communication protocols based on aircraft position and threat priority. Pilots in the most dangerous situations get communication priority, while others maintain radio silence until specifically contacted." Emma nodded approvingly. Hayes was demonstrating exactly the kind of systematic problem-solving that prevented emergencies from becoming tragedies. Implement your protocol modifications in tomorrow's training scenario. We'll test them under maximum stress conditions." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Robert Hayes, the same officer who had once restricted Emma's role to technical maintenance issues. Hayes's attitude toward Emma had changed dramatically after her promotion and the success of her training programs, but their relationship remained professionally cordial rather than personally warm. "Major Sullivan," Hayes began formally, "I have new intelligence about enemy electromagnetic warfare capabilities that requires your assessment." Emma followed Hayes to a secure briefing room where classified documents revealed the sobering reality of modern air combat threats. Enemy nations had developed sophisticated electronic warfare systems specifically designed to disable F-22 communications, navigation, and targeting systems simultaneously. Major intelligence estimates suggest that F-22s operating in contested environments could face electromagnetic interference scenarios significantly more complex than anything we've previously simulated. Emma studied the classified technical specifications, recognizing patterns that exceeded even her most pessimistic threat assessments. The systematic preparation that had saved Bennett's life was about to become even more crucial for pilot survival. "Colonel, based on this intelligence, our current electromagnetic interference training scenarios are insufficient. We need to develop protocols for complete systems failure scenarios where pilots lose all electronic assistance simultaneously." Hayes looked concerned. "Major, are you suggesting that F-22 pilots might need to operate using purely manual procedures?" "Sir, I'm suggesting that pilots need systematic preparation for worst-case scenarios where all advanced systems become liabilities rather than assets. The alternative is deploying pilots who can't function when their technology fails." Emma spent the following weeks developing training scenarios that pushed F-22 pilots beyond anything they'd previously experienced. Her electromagnetic warfare simulations created conditions where navigation, communication, and targeting systems failed simultaneously, forcing pilots to rely on manual procedures that most had never practiced under stress. The results were sobering. Even experienced F-22 pilots struggled with manual navigation and communication protocols when their advanced systems were disabled. Many pilots discovered that their confidence in technology had replaced systematic understanding of fundamental flying skills. "This is exactly what happened to Sophie," Emma told Major Cross during one of their weekly briefings. "She trusted her aircraft's capabilities more than her own systematic preparation." Cross had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned as Emma's deputy director, recognizing that the Advanced Threat Assessment Program required officers who understood both traditional flying and systematic vulnerability analysis. "Emma, your training scenarios are revealing fundamental gaps in pilot preparation that go beyond electromagnetic threats. We're discovering that F-22 pilots have become dangerously dependent on automated systems." Emma nodded grimly. "The F-22's advanced capabilities have created pilots who can perform brilliantly when everything works perfectly, but who struggle when they need to fly manually." The breakthrough came when Emma designed a comprehensive manual flight training program that required F-22 pilots to demonstrate competency in pre-computer age flying techniques. Pilots learned to navigate using celestial positioning, communicate using light signals and hand gestures, and calculate targeting solutions using mental mathematics. The program was initially unpopular among pilots who viewed manual techniques as obsolete skills that had no relevance to modern air combat. But Emma's systematic approach gradually convinced skeptics that understanding fundamental principles made them better pilots even when advanced systems functioned normally. Captain Bennett, who had become one of Emma's most effective instructors, regularly shared his electromagnetic crisis experience with new pilot candidates. "Everything you think you know about flying becomes irrelevant when your systems fail," he would tell them. Major Sullivan's systematic preparation is what separates pilots who come home alive from pilots who don't. Emma's program attracted attention from other military services and allied nations. The Navy requested consultation on electromagnetic vulnerability in carrier-based aircraft. The Army wanted assessment of electronic warfare threats to helicopter operations. International partners sought training in systematic threat analysis for their own advanced fighter programs. Major Sullivan, General Stone announced during a Pentagon briefing, "Your systematic approach to pilot preparation has become the standard for addressing emerging threats across all military aviation programs." Emma felt pride in the recognition, but she remained focused on the fundamental mission that had driven her throughout her career: preventing preventable tragedies. Through systematic preparation, the most meaningful validation came from unexpected sources. Technical Sergeant Carlos Reeves, who had worked with Emma since her early days as a restricted consultant, approached her after a training exercise. "Major, I've been working with Air Force pilots for 20 years. Your systematic approach has created the most competent and safety-conscious pilots I've ever seen. They understand their aircraft better than pilots with twice their flight experience." Emma realized that her transformation from overlooked consultant to program director had accomplished something more significant than personal vindication. She had created institutional change that prioritized systematic preparation over confident performance, comprehensive knowledge over natural ability, and pilot safety over aircraft capabilities. The height restriction that had once defined her limitations had become irrelevant compared to the expertise that now defined the Air Force's approach to F-22 pilot preparation. Emma Sullivan had proved that being too short to fly didn't prevent her from teaching others to fly better than anyone had thought possible. But Emma's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that her systematic approach was preventing tragedies that would have been inevitable under traditional training methods. Every pilot who completed her electromagnetic interference scenarios, every officer who learned manual navigation procedures, every aviator who understood aircraft limitations as thoroughly as capabilities, each represented a life that would return home safely when others might not. The backup pilot who had never been allowed to fly had become the standard by which all pilots were measured. And that standard was saving lives every day. 3 years after Captain Bennett's electromagnetic crisis transformed her from restricted consultant to program director, Major Emma Sullivan stood on the tarmac at Holloman Air Force Base watching the morning sun illuminate a line of F-22 Raptors, preparing for another day of training exercises. But everything had changed since those early mornings when she cleaned windshields on aircraft. She was prohibited from flying. The pilots conducting pre-flight inspections moved with systematic precision that reflected Emma's influence on F-22 operations. They documented discrepancies with the thoroughness she had always demonstrated. They analyzed electromagnetic conditions with the expertise she had developed. They prepared for potential problems with the systematic thinking she had pioneered. Major Sullivan called Lieutenant Colonel Cross, approaching with a folder of mission reports. "The Pentagon wants your assessment of how F-22 electromagnetic vulnerability protocols should be applied to the new 6th-generation fighter program." Emma felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that her systematic approach was shaping aircraft development rather than simply responding to existing problems. The Air Force was finally designing advanced systems with vulnerability assessment built into the development process rather than discovered through dangerous incidents. "Diana, it's remarkable how much has changed since you first supported my unofficial consulting work." Cross smiled, remembering the years when Emma's expertise had been dismissed despite its obvious value. "Emma, you've proven that systematic preparation can overcome any institutional resistance when the alternative is preventable tragedy." As they walked toward the advanced threat assessment facility that now bore Emma's name, they passed the memorial wall where Lieutenant Sophie Sullivan's name remained engraved among fallen aviators. Emma paused, as she did every morning, to silently update her sister on the progress of their shared mission. "Sophie would be proud," Cross said quietly. "You've created systems that prevent exactly the kind of overconfidence that killed her." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with honoring Sophie's memory through systematic safety improvements. "The height restriction that kept me out of cockpits forced me to understand aircraft better than pilots who could fly them. Sophie's death taught me that understanding limitations matters more than exploiting capabilities." Inside the facility, Emma reviewed reports from F-22 installations worldwide. Her electromagnetic vulnerability protocols had prevented 47 potential incidents over the past year. Her systematic preparation methods had produced pilots with lower accident rates and higher mission success percentages than any previous training programs. Most significantly, Emma's approach had influenced aircraft design itself. The seventh-generation fighter program included built-in countermeasures for electromagnetic interference, manual backup systems for all critical functions, and cockpit displays that helped pilots understand system limitations rather than just capabilities. "Major," announced Captain Rebecca Hayes, who had become Emma's senior instructor, "we have visitors from the Navy's F-35 program. They want to implement your systematic vulnerability assessment for carrier-based operations." Emma felt pride in knowing that her methods were spreading beyond the F-22 program to influence all military aviation. The systematic thinking that had saved Bennett's life was becoming standard practice for preparing pilots to handle emerging threats across all aircraft types. The morning briefing included representatives from 6 different military aviation programs, each seeking Emma's expertise in identifying vulnerabilities that traditional training missed. Emma realized that her role had evolved from F-22 specialist to architect of comprehensive pilot preparation philosophy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma began the briefing, "systematic vulnerability assessment isn't about assuming the worst will happen. It's about being prepared when the impossible becomes inevitable." She displayed analysis from recent combat operations where electromagnetic warfare had disabled advanced aircraft systems, forcing pilots to rely on manual procedures that many had never practiced under stress. The data validated everything Emma had been teaching about the importance of systematic preparation. "The pilots who survived these encounters had one thing in common," Emma continued. "They understood their aircraft's limitations as thoroughly as its capabilities. They were prepared for system failures because their training had taught them to respect the difference between technology and competence." After the briefing, Emma walked to her office where photographs of successful F-22 pilots decorated the walls. Aviators whose lives had been saved by systematic preparation techniques she had developed. Each photograph represented validation of the principle that knowledge and thorough analysis mattered more than natural ability or institutional tradition. Captain Bennett appeared in her doorway, now serving as her deputy director after completing advanced training in systematic threat assessment. "Major, the new pilot candidates have completed your electromagnetic interference scenarios. Their performance exceeded all previous standards." Emma smiled, remembering when Bennett had dismissed her expertise as theoretical overcaution. His transformation from skeptical critic to systematic advocate represented the institutional change she had worked years to achieve. "Mark, do you ever regret that electromagnetic crisis that nearly cost you your aircraft?" Bennett considered the question seriously. "Emma, that crisis taught me the difference between confidence and competence. Without that experience, I would have remained a pilot who could perform brilliantly under normal conditions, but who would have been helpless when normal conditions disappeared." As the afternoon sun slanted through her office windows, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her from height-restricted consultant to director of advanced pilot preparation. The systematic approach that had once been dismissed as unnecessary overcaution was now considered essential for pilot survival. Her phone rang with a call from General Stone at the Pentagon. Major Sullivan, congratulations. You've been selected for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and assignment as Director of Pilot Safety for all Air Force operations. Emma felt the satisfaction of knowing that systematic preparation had finally overcome every institutional barrier. But more importantly, she knew that her expanded authority would allow her to prevent tragedies across the entire Air Force rather than just the F-22 program. That evening, Emma stood alone in the hangar where her transformation had begun. The F-22 Raptors sat in perfect formation, but now they represented something different than they had during her early morning inspections years earlier. They were no longer aircraft she was prohibited from flying. They were machines whose limitations she understood better than anyone alive. Technical Sergeant Carlos Reeves approached, carrying maintenance reports that reflected the systematic documentation Emma had implemented throughout F-22 operations. "Colonel Sullivan," he said, using her new rank, "I wanted you to know that in 25 years of military aviation, you've created the safest and most competent pilots I've ever worked with." Emma felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing her systematic preparation was accomplishing its fundamental mission, bringing pilots home alive. The height restriction that had once defined her limitations had become irrelevant compared to the expertise that now defined military aviation safety standards. Lieutenant Sophie Sullivan's death had taught Emma that systematic preparation could prevent preventable tragedies. Captain Bennett's electromagnetic crisis had proved that systematic knowledge could overcome institutional resistance. The Air Force's adoption of her vulnerability assessment protocols demonstrated that systematic thinking could reshape entire organizations. Emma Sullivan had spent years being told she was too short to fly. Instead, she had become tall enough to lift an entire profession to new standards of safety and competence. The backup pilot who was never allowed in the cockpit had become the pilot all others aspired to emulate. And every morning, as new F-22 pilots practiced the systematic preparation techniques that bore her name, Emma knew that Sophie's legacy lived on in procedures that would prevent other families from experiencing the loss that had shaped both their lives. The sky belonged to those who stayed ready for it. And Emma Sullivan had taught an entire generation of pilots that staying ready was the highest calling of military aviation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.